It was a Friday, a warm June evening in a quiet Florida neighborhood. Kids were out. Parents were watching from doorways. Life was moving at the slow, easy pace that this part of the state is known for. And then, at 9 o'clock at night, a single gunshot cracked through the air. A mother of four collapsed in the grass outside a front door. She had been shot through that door, a closed, locked door, by the woman on the other side. The woman on the other side had been on the phone with 911 when she pulled the trigger. Her name was Susan Lauren. And what you are about to hear is not just the story of a single terrible night. It is the story of everything that led up to it, year by year, complaint by complaint, until the only thing left between two neighbors was a door. You're watching Motives and Methods. If true crime storytelling is your thing, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and leave your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's get into it. To understand what happened on Southwest 108th Lane in Ocala, Florida, you first need to understand the place itself. Ocala sits in Marion County, roughly in the heart of the state, far removed from the tourist noise of Orlando or the coastal energy of Tampa. It is slow out here, deliberately slow. Sun-bleached roads stretch out in every direction. Enormous horse farms line the outskirts of town. Ancient stretches of live oak and cypress forest break up the landscape in ways that remind you this part of Florida existed long before any of the rest of it was built. In fact, Ocala is officially recognized as the horse capital of the world. More thoroughbred horses are raised in Marion County than almost anywhere else on Earth. But beyond that distinction, what defines this place? What makes people choose to live here, raise families here, is the pace of it, the quiet. The sense that life here is manageable, predictable, safe. That is what a Jake Owens was looking for when she moved into the Quail Run area of Ocala. Everyone who knew her called her AJ. And by all accounts, she was exactly the kind of person a neighborhood is genuinely better for having. She was a full-time mother to four children. She also worked full-time as a manager at one of the local McDonald's restaurants. Between those two enormous commitments, she poured herself completely into her family. Her social media told that story clearly and honestly. School milestones celebrated with visible pride, silly candid photographs, ordinary afternoons at the beach or out front in the yard. She was not trying to be remarkable. She was trying to be present. When she moved into the Quail Run complex, a cluster of quadplex-style units on Southwest 108th Lane, she was not chasing anything fancy. She needed affordable housing in a safe enough area where her children could go outside and simply breathe. Somewhere with a little grassy common space. Somewhere with the kind of neighbors who look out for each other without making a production of it. Quail Run was not gated. It was not fenced off or manicured. But it had open shared space where children could be children. And for AJ, raising four kids inside a small home, that space was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Neighbors later described her as warm, expressive, and fully present with her kids. She fit into the rhythm of the neighborhood quickly and easily. She belonged there. But here is the thing about living close to other people. The same proximity that creates community, that same closeness, can, under the wrong conditions, produce something else entirely. And that is where Susan Lauren comes in. Now, let's be honest for a moment, because all of us have had neighbor issues at some point. The dog that barks at 3 in the morning. The parking spot that someone has quietly decided is secretly theirs. The music on a Tuesday night when you have work in the morning. That friction is simply part of living near other people. It is normal. It is frustrating. And usually, it stays small. The problem is that when those small annoyances are never properly resolved, they do not simply disappear. They stack up. They accumulate. And eventually, two people stop reacting to the situation directly in front of them and start reacting instead to the long, compressed history of every grievance that came before it. That is what was happening here. Slowly, quietly, over many months. By the year 2021, Marion County deputies were regularly responding to complaints coming out of Quail Run. Most of those complaints were filed by Susan. Most of them were about the same thing. Children playing outside on shared common property. Deputies would arrive, hear two completely different versions of the same situation, and leave without any arrests. The issue would calm down briefly. Then it would flare up again. Officers later described a familiar and exhausting pattern. Show up, listen, leave. Show up, listen, leave. Body camera footage from multiple visits captures that frustration clearly. At one point, officers can be heard discussing Susan out of her earshot. One of them uses a single word to describe her: psycho. And meanwhile, Susan continued to present herself to those same officers as a helpless and quietly suffering victim. A peaceful woman. A perfect neighbor. Living in a state of constant harassment at the hands of her own community. The thing is, the officers she was saying this to had been to her address multiple times. They knew exactly what they were dealing with, and they were not convinced. In February of 2022, things sharpened significantly. Susan called 911 to report that she had been, in her own words, battered. She claimed that during an argument about her dog being on shared property, AJ had thrown a no trespassing sign at her, striking her in the leg. She also made a point of flagging, for the record, that the children in the neighborhood were, and I want to make sure I get her exact phrasing right here, always playing games. When deputies arrived, they observed no visible injuries on Susan. No arrest was made. The accounts were completely contradictory. There were no independent witnesses, and officers left the scene having resolved nothing. Again, what body camera footage from that visit and others does show is the pattern playing out in real time. Officers arriving, listening, growing visibly frustrated, then departing while the underlying problem remained entirely untouched. Each visit would briefly suppress the tension. None of them addressed it. And the repetition arguably made everything feel more serious and more personal than it needed to be. By the summer of 2022, the conflict had crossed into genuinely troubling territory. Susan began using racial slurs toward AJ and toward the children. She also started making direct threats. The kids in the neighborhood, being kids, had their own nickname for her by this point. They called her Karen. And honestly, in any other context, that would simply be funny. But there is a real and important distinction to name clearly here. Children giving a difficult adult a harmless nickname is one thing. An adult directing racial slurs at those same children is categorically something else. One is harmless. The other is not, and it should not be treated as though it is. And at the same time, Susan's behavior at home was changing in ways that, looking back, tell a far more alarming story than anyone realized at the time. She began installing additional locks on her doors. She added security cameras that she could monitor from her phone. She began researching self-defense law in Florida. More specifically, she began researching the state's stand your ground provisions, the legal framework that, under certain conditions, can allow a person to use deadly force if they genuinely believe their life is in danger, without any obligation to first retreat. And then she purchased firearms. 2 of them, a Remington and a Ruger. Both kept fully loaded. Both stored in separate rooms of the home. Now, firearm ownership in Florida is common. It is entirely legal, and on its own, it means nothing. But in this specific context, in the context of 2 years of escalating hostility, of racial slurs directed at children, of a woman who had spent time explicitly familiarizing herself with the legal justification for lethal force, those firearms were not just home security. They were something else. They were preparation. Meanwhile, for AJ and the rest of the families on the block, life was continuing largely as normal. Children played outside. Parents checked in from doorways and windows. People went to work and came home. The situation with Susan was frustrating, genuinely frustrating. But for people with full lives, with 4 kids, with jobs and responsibilities and things to love, there was simply too much else to focus on. For Susan, who had none of that, who lived alone, who worked from home, and who had been feeding this particular obsession for years, the dispute had become everything. It had become her entire world. By June of 2023, all of the ingredients were in place. A long-standing feud, escalating hostility, racial animus, 2 loaded firearms, and a woman who had spent months researching exactly when the law would permit her to use them. It would only take one ordinary Friday evening for all of it to converge. June the 2nd, 2023. It was a Friday. School had ended for the week. The evening was warm, and by nightfall, children were out in the common areas of Quail Run, doing what children in that neighborhood had always done, running around, riding bikes, being loud, being young. According to the people who were there that evening, Susan came outside at some point and, for reasons that are genuinely difficult to explain, picked up one of the children's tablets from the grass and threw it. Then she threw an umbrella. then a roller skate. When AJ heard about it, she did what any parent in that situation would do. She walked over to Susan's unit to address it. She knocked on the front door. At 9:01 in the evening, Susan dialed 911. She told dispatchers that someone was banging aggressively on her door and that she believed a break-in was imminent. The dispatcher told her that deputies were already on their way. Less than 2 minutes after that call ended, Susan retrieved her Remington firearm from inside the residence. The front door between the two women remained closed the entire time. Neither of them could see the other. There was no line of sight whatsoever. There was no visual contact of any kind. Just a locked door, and a woman on each side of it. She fired once. Through the door, AJ was struck by a single bullet to the chest. She collapsed in the grass directly outside Susan's front door, in full view of the children who were still nearby when the shot rang out. Officers and paramedics performed CPR for several minutes at the scene, but there was nothing they could do. That single bullet was enough. Jake Owens was pronounced dead shortly after. She was 35 years old. She was a mother of 4. Her children were present when she was shot. The neighborhood had witnessed almost everything. Within minutes, the street had filled with people. And within hours, it was clear that the community was not just grieving, it was furious. When officers initially brought Susan in for questioning that same night, she was composed. Deliberately, almost unnervingly composed. And her account was consistent from the start. She said she was terrified. She said AJ had been banging on the door so aggressively that she believed her home was about to be broken into. She said she fired not to kill, but to frighten, to make the threat go away. She said she did what she felt she had to. Now, that account raises questions that the evidence cannot fully answer. Susan did call 911 before the shot. That is true, and the prosecution later acknowledged it. But she also fired that gun less than 2 minutes after being told deputies were already on it. If the door was locked and help was coming, what threat, exactly, required lethal force in that specific window of time? Neighbors who were outside that evening would later state, consistently and under oath, that they heard no screaming from AJ. No threats. No aggression. Just a knock. Just a mother at a door. In the early morning hours following the shooting, Susan was released. Authorities cited the need to further evaluate the case under Florida's Stand Your Ground provisions. That decision produced immediate, widespread outrage. Protests erupted both locally and nationally. The neighborhood that had already watched AJ die in the grass outside her neighbor's door was now watching the woman who shot her walk free. Susan left for a hotel that morning. She did not return. 4 days later, on June the 6th, 2023, she was arrested again. This time, investigators had concluded that her use of deadly force was not legally justified under any reasonable interpretation. She was formally charged with manslaughter with a firearm. Susan's trial took place in August of 2024. And for many people who had been following the case, it had become something larger than a single criminal proceeding. It was a genuine, public test of how stand your ground law applies when the physical evidence tells one story and the claimed fear tells another. The prosecution laid out its case plainly. AJ was unarmed. The door was locked. Deputies had been told they were already on the way less than 2 minutes before the shot was fired. AJ had no documented history of violence toward anyone in the neighborhood, and the two women never had any visual contact. Not once, during the entire confrontation. There was no immediate and credible physical threat, the prosecution argued, that could justify firing that weapon in that moment. The threat, to whatever extent it existed, was a knock on a locked door. Susan chose not to testify in her own defense. The jury heard from multiple neighbors, several deputies, a 911 operator, and a range of forensic experts who methodically reconstructed the timeline of that evening. On August the 16th of 2024, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. Manslaughter with a firearm. 3 months later, in November of 2024, the judge issued the sentence. 25 years in prison. I will say this honestly. I have seen people convicted of outright first-degree murder receive considerably less time than that. So whatever your feelings about the specific charge, the judge did not hold back on the consequence. For the community, for AJ's family, the verdict provided something. A small, hard-won measure of acknowledgement that what happened that night was not self-defense. It was not justified. It was not legal. But it was not over. Because Susan was not done. Following the verdict, she pushed back against everything. She threatened to countersue AJ's family. She reportedly threatened to sue Netflix. She gave interviews in which she continued to insist she had done nothing wrong. Susan said in one of the interviews, "I just want people to know the truth, that I am not a racist, that I did not do this on purpose. We all have bad days. Just get over it and move on. Because if you hold on to that, your life is going to be miserable," said by a woman serving 25 years in prison. About the mother she shot through a closed door, while that mother's 4 children grew up without her. Jake Owens was not a legal precedent. She was not a symbol. She was not a headline, even though she became one. She was a woman raising 4 children in a small, full, loud, and loving home. She was the kind of parent who celebrated her kids' school milestones online because those moments genuinely mattered to her. The kind of mother who would step outside on a Friday evening to stand up for her child, because that is what good mothers do. The people who knew her do not describe her as a victim. They describe her warmth, her humor, the way her entire world quite literally revolved around those 4 children. She was simply living an ordinary evening in her own neighborhood, and she never got to finish it. To AJ's family, I am so deeply sorry. I know that no verdict and no sentence gives back what those 4 children lost on that evening. And I hope that as time passes, they are able to find some measure of peace alongside the justice that was finally, if imperfectly, delivered. If you ask me whether this should have been charged as murder rather than manslaughter, my honest answer is yes. The deliberate research into stand your ground law. The 2 loaded firearms were kept in separate rooms. 2 years of racial slurs directed at children. A shot fired through a locked door less than 2 minutes after being told police were already on the way. That pattern, taken together, does not read as panic. It reads as preparation. But that is my view. And the whole point of the comments section is that yours might be different. So what do you think? Should Susan have been charged with murder rather than manslaughter? And do you believe 25 years was the right sentence? Or should it have been longer? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to hear where you land on this one. If you found this video worthwhile, a like genuinely helps this channel more than you might think. And if you want more true crime stories told like this one, subscribe to Motives and Methods. New videos every week. I will see you in the next one. Stay safe, stay curious, and thank you, as always, for being here.